Are we filming? Yes, we are. So welcome to another video. I was going to make this response to a viewer's comment. I was going to make it part of the next podcast. But then I was thinking about it and I thought this is a real issue that needs a video all of its own, and it's a hot potato, as we say in the UK. It is without a doubt a hot potato, and this may tread on some people's toes. It's a tricky one, but I'm going to be as you know, I'm very forthright. I don't mean to upset anybody inadvertently, but I'm giving a forthright answer and a fair answer, hopefully fair, to this person. I think they're a lady, but I can't be sure, so I'm going to just refer to them as they rather than he or she. But I think it's a she because of the binder involved. But let me start at the beginning. They say, I have been using a personal classic croc since December 2018, so nearly 7 full years. At the time, it cost me a grand total of $173.52, according to my records. And while that was something of a bargain at the time, it was still more money than I think it was really worth. Well, the classic croc is at the top of the Filofax range or thereabouts. I've never owned one, partly because they're not only expensive to buy, but they're also expensive to buy secondhand as well. And so one of them hasn't come my way yet. But, it looks okay. I'm not sure about I can't really comment about it because I don't know anything about the flatability or the rings. Maybe it's got better quality rings rather than the budget rings that you see mainly in lower price Filofaxes. I don't know. It may be a full leather binder, or it may be one of the more normal synthetic jobs where it's just man-made materials with a thin layer of leather glued on top. You know the sort of thing I'm talking about, like the Malden, like the Norfolk, like many of the. I cannot think at the moment of a full leather binder that Filofax make. They used to make many, as we know, but I don't think they make any now. But who knows? I can't really comment on the classic croc other than the fact I'm aware of it, and I know it's expensive, maybe reassuringly expensive. I don't know. But this person says more money than I think it was really worth. Okay. Today, that same Filofax sells for £350, sort of the recommended retail price. And the best I have found is $300 as a street price. Okay. After 30 years of using Filofax brand exclusively, I still have my 1994 Filofax A5 system organizer, brackets, the Windsor model. Though I no longer use it for anything but storage, I have finally learnt to keep my Filofax in a fabric zipper pouch to protect it inside my handbag or briefcase. But as much as I would like to buy the same personal classic croc model in a different colour for fashion purposes, I simply cannot bring myself to pay nearly double only 8 years later, when I can get an equivalent model from Moterm today for less than $70. I mean, that's a big price difference, isn't it? There are already quality concerns enough with the classic croc. The flimsy elastic pen loop, which doesn't even fit my fountain pens, not least amongst them, and the quality has not improved since the range was first introduced. If Filofax is going to continue to raise prices to this extent, then I am going to expect a much higher level of quality for my money. I think it was in 2019 that I purchased a Moterm, but I've never actually used it. Although the quality is certainly nearly as good as my Filofax, it sits in a drawer awaiting my eventual whimsy. I've also entirely given up on the secondary market, and this is what I want to address. Okay, I've also entirely given up on the secondary market. In fact, I did so a long time ago already, probably 2015 or 2016 was the last time I bothered buying a used Filofax, because as collecting of Filofaxes gained in popularity, the prices became unreasonable and the supplies dried up of the best models, which are now being hoarded by collectors. And this is why I want to devote some time about this potentially controversial subject. And I speak with some element of guilt here because I am a collector. I own more than 200 binders now. Many of them, the majority of them, are actually Filofaxes, the Filofax brand. It's a tricky thing because since I was a teenager, I've been buying and selling stuff predominantly to make money. I mean, it's a tricky thing with Filofaxes because I'm a collector more than a dealer, so I buy far more than I sell. But when I sell one, it is a view to making a profit, just like any other dealer in any other field. You know, whether it's been bicycles or fountain pens, but there is, in my heart of hearts, an element of, and I often say this in a joking way, but it is true. I say you cannot have too many Filofaxes, and I'm sure that just me personally, I'm not going to have much effect on the value of Filofaxes in a global market, but clearly there are many people that collect Filofaxes, and clearly I have a following on YouTube because I'm mainly talking about an enthusing over vintage Filofaxes. Although you must give me some rope here, because I have over the last 18 months I have bought a handful of brand new Filofaxes with my own money to have a look at them and review them. And so I think I've done 3 or 4. I've done the Filofax Heritage, the Saffiano Compact Zip. I've done the Malden. There's another one I've done. I can't remember which one. And I'm pretty sure. And I have been, shall we say, window shopping. So I have had a look at binders that I haven't yet bought, like the Norfolk, and commented and reviewed them in a sort of superficial way. By popular request. So clearly there are people out there, viewers out there, who want me to review modern binders in the current range, but it's mainly been vintage binders. And I have been specialising in not just reviewing and enthusing over vintage binders, because there are some vintage binders that are rubbish, frankly. But I have looked at more recent binders from the last 30 years, and it sounds crazy, isn't it, that, you know, we're now talking about, it's been just over 30 years since production predominantly stopped in the UK. So you can have a binder that's 30 years old, nearly an entire working career old, and it's not a vintage binder anymore. Although there are some where I could call, I sometimes equate them as vintage. that were built in they're made in the sweet spot of the Filofax production era, in my humble opinion, namely the Filofax Lyndhurst, although there are one or two issues with Lyndhurst occasionally, but I really rate the Filofax Lyndhurst. But at the top of the tree, for me, are the Filofax Kensington. Very, very good. It's not vintage, technically, but it is fantastic enough to be called vintage, in my opinion. But people's mileage will vary about this. I see it as if you don't look at a vintage wine and say, no, that's not vintage because it's not 100 years old or 50 years old or whatever. You say the vintage quality is certainly wine is whether it's a good year, and that could be fairly recent. So I'm in two minds about that. But I know some people are sticklers. A vintage binder can only be one made in the UK way back earlier than, say, 1994, typically. But I mainly talk about vintage binders. And I talk about more modern binders, and I review them because I want to see how they're standing up. So if you look at, I've done a review a few days ago of this Filofax Professional Organizer. So it's a Deskvax version, 3 rings. It's 9 rings. And I mentioned the fact that it's a thin. It looks like it says real leather, but it's not really real leather. What it is a man-made, a binder made of man-made materials, synthetic materials, over which a very, very thin layer of leather has been attached, glued, and it's so thin that even it on the corners and even the spine here, and here, the leather has worn away to reveal the man-made substrate underneath. So I wouldn't regard this as a leather binder. It's just it's kind of it's just like a very, very thin surface layer is a very, very thin layer of leather that's just stuck on. But that I find that interesting. The construction, the way the construction has changed over the years. But how is the market? And this is the crunch. And this is where I'm going to be a little bit controversial. Filofax has gone from making binders out of a nice piece of top grain leather to mainly, although there are one or two exceptions, like the Filofax Original, which isn't original but is called original, but it's kind of like a pastiche of what we used to. They're playing on the marketing, aren't they? For want of a better word, and they appear to be a piece of leather, through and through. But I'm not sure. I haven't cut one in half to see. But I do have I have bought a Filofax Original, and I'm not very impressed. It was one of the patent versions. I've done a review, and the leather is the surface layer is cracking, and the leather is cracking and discolouring, and I don't like it. I don't like it. Maybe I would like one of the ones made. I believe the very first Filofax Originals were made by the Cambridge Satchel Company, where the leather really was leather. I'm not sure. Dangerous grounds, so I can't really speak from experience. But what I can say, as the owner of nearly 200 Filofaxes and other binders, the oldest of which is over 100 years old, I have many from the sort of 70s and 80s and 90s and early 2000s, not so many modern ones. In my opinion, I'm not saying the quality is worse or better, but what I have found, and this is how I interpret things, the vintage ones prior to manufacturing being moved to the Far East, the vintage ones had better rings, less prone to misalignment or gaps, and they feel smoother in operation. They're not so, shall we say, clickety-clackety, and some of the vintage ones are an absolute joy to use. I mean, unless you have used one of these sets of rings, you may not be aware of the difference in quality. But holy moly, if you're willing to take the risk of feeling a little bit of losing a little bit of love for your modern binder, then take a risk, have a look, open the rings and feel the quality of vintage ring mechanisms. They are a joy to operate. There are issues with flatability with the old ones because the leather, not always is there good flatability to start with. You might have to wait 25 years before it opens flat and stays flat, which is why I actually like some of the very last to be made in England, like the Sherwood of the 1993 Sherwoods. And if you're looking for one binder to outlast all other binders, go for a 93 Sherwood, and be very aware that later ones, the materials were cheapened, the leather was cheapened, it's not so nice. So you've got to be very careful and make sure you get an early one, not a later one where the leather is not so good. But that's a whole basket of snakes, and that's something I can't deal with in this video. But from the situation of the actual price of good quality vintage binders on the second-hand market is concerned, these are the things I think about. There is a limited market because these binders are not being made. Yes, there are some binders made of this quality that are made exclusively for the Japanese market, who have arguably higher expectations than here in the UK. And so these binders are made to vintage designs. I believe they're made in India, and then they sell in the Japanese market. And then occasionally you come across one that is listed on eBay, and typically it might be $400, something like that. So there are some still being made to earlier vintage designs of very high quality materials, because they're being marketed at connoisseurs and collectors in Japan who have the money to pay good money for these facsimile editions occasionally. But in general, these aren't available. So it is a limited market. And in the same way as there's a limited market for Ming vases or vases, you're not going to get a bargain. And are there more people looking at vintage binders nowadays? Yes. And it's not just me, but I do hold my hands up. Here am I, when I say a global audience, I don't mean like a massive, I've got a massive fan base out there, but I do, my videos are viewed many thousands of times a month, and it's a very niche market. So I'm sure that my videos have an effect, and it is true. I'm sure that the effect is if I'm talking about certain vintage binders, like the Filofax Sherwood, for instance, when one of those comes up on eBay, it does go for more money. There was the classic effect where here was I talking about arguably what I still consider to be the greatest Filofax ever made, and that is the Guildford Mini Extra Slim, notwithstanding the fact that the liner peels and is just horrendous. But there is a big demand for that binder because people can remove the leather and get it down to that bluey grey fabric base, and it looks nice, but it takes a lot of work. But there is a lot of demand out there. I'm sure that many people have their email alerts set for the Guildford Mini Extra Slim, because when they come up, no doubt they will go for a lot more money than they used to. And am I partly responsible for that? I guess I am. There are binders like the Filofax Sherwoods, and people are always saying to me, regularly ask, have you got one in your collection I can buy, And the answer is not specifically, but occasionally I do let some go, but not actually recently. I probably sold about 10 last year, and I don't think I've sold any this year. But I might from time to time. But if you talk about a product in glowing terms, and I do, and you're in you're on YouTube, people are going to see that, then that's obviously going to raise expectations in the market, and it's supply and demand. So yes, I'm pretty sure that I am part of that, although I'm just one of many people extolling the virtues of vintage binders. But do you know what I think is the biggest factor that is raising, and this is where I'm going to be a little bit controversial, the biggest reason, in my opinion, why vintage Filofaxes are rising on the second-hand market is because of the Filofax brands themselves. Despite them being aware of the surge in interest in full leather binders of old with really high quality ring mechanisms, as I record this in October 25, they don't seem to be keen in any way to address that demand by getting their contractors in India to produce vintage, in inverted commas, models for the UK market, as they currently do from time to time for the Japanese market. I don't know why they don't, but obviously I'm not privy to the Filofax brand's boardroom. I don't even know whether they're aware of it. I'm pretty sure they're aware of it, but they have decided not to do anything about it. So the fact that they appear not to want to address that market and generate extra revenue for themselves means that people are kind of aware that if they want a vintage style binder with good full thickness leather and good rings, they've got two choices. They can either buy one on the second-hand market, typically eBay, but there are other online platforms where they occasionally turn up. A little bit more difficult in the States. I appreciate that, which probably makes prices go even higher. There's also the fact that sellers, when they want to sell something, they will look at the price of today's Filofaxes, which certainly in the States, the price is rocketing up. I mean, I can't remember. Let's have a look what the seller said. Okay, they said that a new one was on the Filofax website, presumably in the States, in the US, was a stonking $350. So about 300 quid. Whereas here, I think they're about 160 or 175, something like that. So noticeably, lots of people have said to me over the last few weeks, it might be due to tariffs, perhaps, but they have said that the prices have gone ballistic in the US. So if you are a seller and you're aware that prices have gone ballistic, then you're minded to think, well, it means that maybe I can pitch my second-hand price slightly higher because it's still very competitive compared to a modern binder. So I think the awareness is one factor. The reluctance of the Filofax brands to want to satisfy that demand in any way. I've got a little midge floating around on my camera. Let's see if that goes now. Are we still filming? Yes, we are. So I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure that I have a small influence in second-hand prices going up, and I do apologise for that. There's nothing I can do. I can't reduce my prices. Reducing my prices for the common goods would be like saying to my grandchildren, "Well, that I'm going to reduce my profits because there are people that are chomping at the bit to buy." I mean, it's just the way of it, isn't it? You know, I'm a dealer, and I have bought furniture. I bought a pair of chairs for £1 at a provincial auction because people didn't know what they were, and I sold them for nearly 1,000. Well, I'm not going to sell them for £2 just because I bought them for £1. I'll sell for whatever the market will bear, and that's the same with anything. Go to your local Ford dealership. They're not going to be selling things. They're not going to subsidise purchases by dropping their margins for the common good. Every single business has a duty either to shareholders, or if you're an individual, you have a duty to put food on your table for your family, to sell for the highest price you can get within reason. And that's really tricky. That's really tricky if you're selling something where the supply is finite and the demand is unlimited, potentially. Very, very tricky. But it is reality. It is reality. One thing that I would say is making a little bit of a difference. So the buyer said, the commentator was saying that her Motum, nearly as good. She's describing it as nearly as good as her classic croc. Only costs 70 quid, £70 brand new. And we have other players on the scene. You know, if you want shall we say a Filofax Guildford Mini Extra Slim, would I want to pay 80, 90, £100 for one of those now, compared to maybe a similar price for a Me Plus, which is made of arguably much higher quality leather and genuine Krauss rings. There are new players, and Plotter, who have been around for 6 years now, Japanese made, the very, very best materials, similar to Me Plus. There's Woozy Studio as well. I've got binders from all three of those companies, and they are they don't have pockets. So if you're after something with pockets, then maybe Filofax or Moterm or Van der Spek. But if you want a slimline binder, very, very simple, then the quality of leather and the rings with one of those aforementioned three companies is in the stratosphere compared to the leathers that Filofax use. I mean, Filofax don't even give any provenance of the leather. They just stamp it real leather or something, but you're not told where this leather is coming from. So you don't know, do you? You don't know. And yet other companies, rival companies, are actually making a feature of the leather by telling you not only what type of leather, but what tannery. I've been chasing this little fly midge for about a week now, and I just can't catch it. But they make a feature of telling you not only what leather it is, but where it comes from, the actual tannery that made it, and the process by which the leather is cured and tanned. And they're using that, and they're talking about things like flatability and how they recognise that flatability is important, and how they manufacture their binder to make sure it's got perfect flatability. They talk about the rings and how they use Krauss rings because they're the best you can get. And yet with Filofax, there's not a dicky bird. They never mention any of those things. Why? Because, well, I don't know. Why do they not mention those things? Arguably, it's because there's nothing really that they're not really doing anything about flatability. They're not picking the best rings. They're not picking the best leathers. So they're not going to really mention that. But there's definitely, I think, a demand for used vintage Filofaxes because of that. Because people like the Filofax brands, perhaps, and want to stick to the Filofax brand, but they want the sort of quality that you can maybe arguably only get with a vintage binder, because the modern ones are just plastic binders with a leather covering, and they're not always great with the flatability either. So there's a massive demand. It's a growing demand. It's a finite resource, i.e. the number of binders available. The only good thing I would say is, by virtue of the fact that second-hand binders are going up in value, and clearly they are. Typically the four-ring binders made of kid leather, I would typically pick up those for sort of £3 or £4 4 years ago, and now sellers are jumping on the bandwagon and trying to sell them for between £25 and £50. So it's a big jump. The silver lining that I was going to mention was the fact that there's a lot of yuppies, for want of a better word. There was a lot of early adopters of the Filofax brand in the 80s when it became a fashionable item, who are now, many of them are passing away. And so a lot of these are being discovered in drawers, etc., by their relatives, who will then have a quick look on their smartphone. Oh, Filofax, eBay. Oh, they actually go for quite a lot of money. This is the model. Oh, this. So it's easy to see how a lot of these binders, instead of being thrown away, they're being sold on eBay. So the fact that there are higher prices now means there's more likely to have vintage binders that have disappeared for 30 or 40 years come back into the scene, onto the market, and those binders, once sold to an enthusiast, can be enjoyed as they should be. And having that happen means that the although the demand is there, the supply rises some point, and so that means that it will have a calming effect of the price. But yeah, there's no getting away from it. A lot of people are interested in paper-based quality. A lot of people are interested in the Filofax brand. A lot of people are aware now that there is an inherent difference between the construction and the materials used of binders made in England back in the day, between the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s and early 90s. There's a lot to choose from. And the fact that Filofax are not satiating or meeting that desire in their current range, because they're just making most of their binders are just plastic binders with a leather covering, rather than a pure leather binder. This is a Woozy Studio. I haven't used this yet, but it's got these fantastic rings. And smells heavenly, whereas my Filofax Heritage, which I bought a couple of years ago now, doesn't smell of leather at all, even though it says premium leather. I don't think this interior is actually leather. It must be a leather, premium leather bonded onto a plastic substrate, I think. And no smell, heavenly smell. No leather smell, heavenly leather smell. So you can see why there is a demand for binders like this, either independent manufacturers or vintage Filofaxes of old made of this sort of leather, compared to today. It's I can only speak for myself. I don't see this. I bought it because I was intrigued, but it's not my go-to binder. So it is a tricky thing, but I suppose the one good thing is, if you do buy if you look at it like this. Say you buy a vintage 3CL and it's in really good condition. So it's a slimline binder, very similar in size and shape to the modern Filofax Heritage. And it is, let's see if I can see one. Let's have a go. I'm treading on some bubble wrap here. Let's see. No, that's not one. Which one is this? No, that's not one. I've got to find one sooner or later. Okay, what have we got here? Okay, so this is a 3CL. Okay, very similar to this one. Okay, so this is a more modern one. This is a 3CL, made in England. It says, there we go, real calf, not real leather. It's real calf, so that suggests that this is calf leather, not some other sort of leather that might be called real leather, but it might be bonded leather or all sorts of things. It's real calf, made in England, and look at this. It's starting to wear. It's heavily worn, but it still lasts. The rings are fantastic, and look at the flatability. Isn't that fantastic? And it has the look. It has the look of work accomplished. And I've said this several times. You don't want a modern, well, you might want one that's pristine, but but it makes you look like a newbie, as if you've only just started it. If you've got one that's heavily used, people go, oh, they're a seasoned paper-based productivity guy or lady. This is a similar one, but this is let's go for this one. So this is like a modern Filofax slimline, probably about 20 years old, but made in the Filofax era. But look at the flatability of this. How can you use that? I would say, how can you possibly make something like that and then put it on the open market when, I mean, it'd be like selling a Ford pickup where you have to hold the doors open to get in, because if you let go of them, they slap shut and chop your children's fingers off because you accidentally how can you market something like this and claim it is real leather when it's made of plastic with a thin sliver of a thin layer, covering on top? There's no chance of this plastic underneath being trained and like leather can. It's just always going to be. This is 20 years old. It looks like it's been used in anger quite a bit, and yet it's rubbish, isn't it? I would say rubbish. I'm not afraid to say that. This is a rubbish binder because it's not suitable for the use to which it's designed. You can't use this unless you have a personal assistant to hold it open, or some sort of Heath Robinson device to hold it open for you. It's just pointless, absolutely pointless. And that is why something like this, which is the vintage equivalent, this is why this is so desirable. If this went on eBay today, it'll be snapped up within minutes, because lots of people will have eBay alerts set so that as soon as one of these vintage 3CL Filofax, they'd be alerted to it all over the world. Well, not all over the world, because I don't ship over the world because of the VAT regulations here in the UK that changed in 2021. Before that, I was shipping all over the world with antiques up until that moment, and then I had to stop. But anyway, that's another story. But I'll leave it there. The bottom line is you're going to have to pay a little bit. But one thing, and I'll just leave it with this, with you this. If you had to pay, where is it, £100 for one of these, okay, it would be about the same price as one of these, but this might only last you a few years. This could last 100 years. You could leave it to your great-grandchildren. What I would say is £100 over 100 years is £1 a year. So from a point of view of cost of ownership, even if you have to pay, say, £100 for this, instead of, shall we say, 4 years ago, it was maybe £30, okay? The difference is only an extra 70p a year. £30 over 100 years, or £100 over 100 years, it's less than a quarter of a cup of Starbucks coffee, isn't it? In the grand scheme of things. So I would still say that a vintage Filofax, even if you have to pay slightly more than you had hoped, is, without a doubt, one of the bargains of the century. Thanks very much for watching. Till my next video. Goodbye.